Good morning. On behalf of Pomerleau General Contractors, I am pleased to introduce Joseph Mancinelli, International Vice President and Central and Eastern Canada Regional Manager, LiUNA, which is the Labor's International Union of North America. Pomerleau, with strong roots in Quebec, is a coast-to-coast construction company and one of the largest GCs in Canada. Whether it's buildings, infrastructure, or civil works, we deliver a wide variety of projects and are quite active in the P3 marketplace. At Pomerleau, we are passionate about innovation and state-of-the-art technologies. From construction delivery methods to creative financing, we always find a strategy. Helping to construct and operate some of our projects are LiUNA members. But did you know that the labor union is one of the biggest investors in infrastructure? Today, Joel will discuss why he spearheaded LiUNA's almost $8 billion pension fund to make significant investments in P3 infrastructure projects across the country. This bold initiative means the union's 120,000 Canadian members are benefiting from the strong returns these investments have generated. In addition to his work with LiUNA, Joe is also an advocate of community building and champion of benevolent causes. He's an ardent supporter of the arts, is passionate about the restoration of historical sites, and is an accomplished artist in his own right. Please help me welcome Joseph Mancinelli to the stage.
What a pleasure to be with all of you, ladies and gentlemen, in this early morning. I want to thank Mark Romoff and the board of the Council for Public-Private Partnerships for the invitation to speak to you this morning. So LiUNA is one of the largest construction unions in Canada. We have about 600,000 members across the United States and Canada, and Ontario in particular is one of the largest concentrations of membership anywhere in North America. In fact, our market share in Ontario is the largest region in North America, and we have the greatest market share because of our relationship that we have with our 2,000 plus contractors that we enjoy an excellent partnership and relationship with. We have about 100,000 members in Ontario and about 130,000 across the country. We are a multi-skilled workforce, and the slide that you have before you shows the depth of skill of our members. We represent membership in about 40 different sectors in the construction industry. Why do we have a high level of productivity, and how are we involved in so many different sectors? And it all comes down to training and making sure that we have a very productive workforce. The slide before you shows a number of the different training centers that we have, about 20 training centers right across Canada, 12 of them in Ontario in every major city where we train and retrain a number of construction workers. A big challenge nowadays, one of our greatest challenges, is to replenish the amount of workers that are retiring, and we're having a heck of a time bringing young people into the construction industry. We're working very closely with the provincial government to ensure that we can introduce some comprehensive construction classes in the high schools. We used to have that years ago. They got eliminated because of budget cuts, but it's time to reintroduce that and partner with the provincial government and other agencies, contractor associations, etc., to ensure that we've got a viable and productive workforce for the future. We have a lot of strategic partnerships, as you can see on this slide. We're a member of the Chamber of Commerce, Ontario Chamber, different Chamber of Commerces across Ontario, Civic Action, Board of Trade. A little unusual, folks say that a trade union belongs to these organizations, but we feel that we are an integral part of the communities that we live in. We build these communities, so why not participate in organizations that are the same mind and want to achieve the same goals. One of our most ambitious projects is to organize and train Indigenous youth. And we talk about replenishing the workforce, but we've got a gigantic workforce right here in Canada that has not had the opportunity to access good training and good jobs, good high-paying jobs. And so in 2007, LiUNA embarked on a project with then Assembly of First Nations Chief Phil Fontaine and signed the very first accord in 2007. In 2016, we signed the First Nations Summit Accord with Chief Ed John in British Columbia. And again in 2016, we renewed our accord, an open-ended one, mind you. Does not, there's no sunset clause in that accord, and we signed it with the Assembly of First Nations with Chief Perry Bellegarde, the present Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. We've had a lot of success in training Indigenous youth, but it's still not enough. We need to look at either new immigration patterns and, again, making sure that we train youth that is in the high schools and colleges that can pursue a career in construction. In 1972, one of the greatest things that I think happened to our organization, we started a centralized pension plan. And this is an unusual setup for trade unions because right across Canada, there's a lot of parochialism where a number of trade unions have in their individual pension plans, individual benefit plans, as opposed to have a centralized one. But in 1972, we started the Central and Eastern Canada Pension Plan that grew from very modest beginnings and now is very close to $8 billion. We have about 114,000 members that access that plan, 22,000 pensioners right now that receive a decent pension from the LiUNA pension plan, and we have 2,300 contributing employers that participate in sending funds for their employees into that pension plan. The next slide shows, and this is from Benefits Canada, that we are number 48 of the top 100 pension plans in Canada. You'll notice that in 2015, and this is a little hard to read because the writing is pretty small, in 2015 we were at close to $6 billion, and now in 2018 we're on our way to $8 billion in assets. The next slide shows that we are, Benefits Canada, 5th fastest growing pension plan in the country. And there we are, number 5 there. Again, that is dated. It dates back to 2015 as well. So why did LiUNA get involved with infrastructure? And before I get into the details of that, we need to look at the economy and what the economy has produced and what the economy has done as far as injecting funds into infrastructure projects. After the Second World War, and if you look at this graph, in 1955 is where this graph starts, you'll see that we were on going up with spending on infrastructure. But since that time, and it was rather obvious that there was a gap during the Second World War where a lot of the infrastructure didn't get done, and in fact a lot of steel was produced only for military use as opposed to using it for building. And so that glut, you saw a bump. But since that time, we've seen a dramatic decrease in spending in infrastructure. And you can see that it bottomed out somewhere around 2005, 2006. But then there's an increase again because of the commitment to governments in trying their very best to improve infrastructure, and primarily through P3s in that period of time. So if we look at some of the infrastructure, and I only have a couple of slides with examples of where we are, this particular one shows you how old our infrastructure is. And in fact, if you look at that gray area and the dark purple area above it, and the blue and the dark gray, which represents 100-year-old infrastructure and more, those four pieces of the pie make up 44% of infrastructure, which means that our infrastructure from 40 years old to 100 years old makes up almost 50% of our infrastructure, which is absolutely unacceptable in a young country like Canada. If we look at public transit now, very similar actually, where you see that infrastructure is in fair condition to poor condition to very poor condition. Again, 44% from fair to very poor condition. And what that chart actually shows is that it would take about $25 billion to replace public transit. And I think that that is understated as well. This next chart shows where the funds have come from and where they are at. And we've seen a gigantic shift from 1955, when the federal government was very active in funding a number of infrastructure projects, and now you can see that it is at 1.8% of the funding for infrastructure projects comes from the federal government, the municipal and provincial governments taking the lion's share of government funding for infrastructure projects, which presents a pretty big problem, which I'll show in another slide shortly. So this particular slide shows you predictions from the Canadian Chamber, Canada West Foundation, Canadian Centre for Public Policy Alternatives, and the Federation of Canadian Municipalities as well. And you can see that they vary quite a bit. But if you take an average, just the average there, the deficit would be, let's say on the high side, $270 billion, and on the low side, $110 billion. It is still an enormous amount of infrastructure deficit that our country faces. Again, this is a slide that shows an increase in non-governmental funding for these projects, which reinforces the fact that P3s, and that would be the red line there that shows the non-governmental is increasing in an incredible rate as opposed to the government funding of infrastructure projects. This next slide is again shows once again the green being the municipalities taking on the lion's share of infrastructure funding, but they bring in, on the left, they bring in the least amount of income when it comes to funding infrastructure, which presents a gigantic problem. This other slide again reinforces that. You'll see once again that the federal government, being in the very light green, has gone completely down to a very small amount of funding, whereas the municipalities and the provincial have increased dramatically. This next slide shows you the Ontario government's projections on spending on infrastructure. And what it shows you is that in this slide that they have fallen short on our expectations on where the money should be spent. And in fact, if you take away affordable housing, tourism and cultural centers, and childcare and education and even health, what you're left with public transit and highways, et cetera, is 55 billion and 26 billion. It's a fair chunk of money, but certainly not enough if you saw the deficits that in the previous slides, clearly not enough. This slide shows you where the deficit is. Now, I think that there's a fairly strong argument that the 2018 numbers there, 17 and 18, where it was 308 billion, the previous audit that was done by the new provincial government shows that it could be higher than another 10 billion in excess of that 308 as well. So here is an infamous highway in Ontario, and it's the Gardiner Expressway. And this is probably one of the best case studies that can be made and arguments that can be made that we have lagged so far behind in our infrastructure. This highway was built in 1963. It is the same age as my wife. My wife is in much better shape than this highway, I have to tell you. But 1963, we've had a Band-Aid approach to, re-asphalting, doing some structural restoration work on the bottom of the Gardiner, but really, quite frankly, for the largest city in Canada, this is unacceptable that we have this as the only entrance to our downtown core. This is what it looks like underneath. And for some of you who drove in this morning, you saw the crumbling infrastructure of the Gardiner Expressway. This next slide shows it even better. There is a ton of work to be done in order to restore the Gardiner, but I think that there should be alternatives. Quite frankly, I represent 130,000 guys that like to do the restoration work on the Gardiners. That's not the point. The point of the matter is that you need a new road coming into the city, something that can bring the millions of people in and out of the city in a fast and safe manner. In fact, if you look at this next slide, kind of interesting that a number of cities around the world have done innovative things like bury roads and to alleviate the amount of traffic. Now, when I tell you where this is, it really does show you how far behind we've fallen. This is Tehran, Iran, right? Now, if Iran can do this kind of infrastructure in order to bypass the congestion in their downtown core, certainly Toronto should as well. So why has LiUNA's pension plan invested in so many P3s? Well, let's have a look at the investments of our stocks and bonds. Our equities and our bond market have produced decent returns, but not nearly as good as our alternative investments like P3s and infrastructure investing as well. So the average there would be 7.6% return, which is not a bad return, but clearly not as good as getting into public-private partnerships. So there's a misconception out there, and the myth is that trade unions don't like P3s. And it is a myth, and it is a misconception because, quite frankly, we love them. We love them because it's a win-win situation. Our contractors get to bid on the work. Our members get to do the work. The government gets a pass on spending the amount of public funds that are required in order to do this kind of work. And the risk is completely transferred to the P3 consortium. P3 consortium keeps the asset for a certain amount of years, depending on the procurement process, and then hands it back to the government. It is an excellent program. There is another myth that it is a form of privatization. And I hear this all the time. And I spoke at the very first P3 conference when Michael Wilson actually was the chairing it way back at Hotel Toronto. I don't think that's the Hilton now, so I'm dating. That was 11 years ago, I believe. And then I spoke at the P3 conference 3 years ago, and every time I spoke, and I'm not sure if it's going to happen today, there are folks within the trade union movement that confuse P3s with privatization. And they always use the 407 as the example of a P3 that, quite frankly, is not a P3. It was sold The 407 was sold. It is not a P3. It may have been built that way, but it certainly was sold off as a privatization. A P3 is not a privatization, and this is a myth that, quite frankly, needs to be dispelled. So these are numbers which shows how impressive the Canadian construction industry leverages so much economic development in Canada. This is according to the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, where 1.4 million Canadians work in the construction industry, and it contributes $72 billion into the Canadian economy. So if we look at that number, 1.4 billion, we're at 130, so we're almost at 10%. LiUNA represents 10% of the construction workers in the country. If you add on then all of the engineering and part of the construction industry that indirectly are involved, that's another 100,000 Canadians that also contribute 21.4 billion to the economy. So how does P3 grow the economy? There it is. $4.20 in economic activity every time we do P3. $1.60 in private investment and $1.10 in added federal and provincial tax revenues. Just recently, Minister McNaughton, and I know that he's speaking here this morning as well, Minister McNaughton recently said that for every dollar that we do in infrastructure, there's a multiplier effect of $6. So for every $1 billion that we do in infrastructure, there's another $6 billion in economic activity that gets injected into the economy. In an average year, P3s create $14 billion in economic activity, and I think these numbers are fairly conservative as well. $4 billion in private investment and 115,000 job years. So as a leader of the largest construction union, I'm sure that you will agree that producing 115,000 job years is very, very important to the members of LiUNA. So this is a bridge that we built. This was the Confederation Bridge, which is a P3 in between New Brunswick and PEI. And we built this $1.3 billion bridge. I think it's 12 kilometers long. It was called the Fixed Link. Now it's the Confederation Bridge. OMERS, one of the larger pension plans in Canada, is one of the P3 consortium partners in this bridge. 5,000 workers worked on building the Confederation Bridge. Those are workers. They were members. I would say 90% of the workers on that job were LiUNA members. We did everything on that project, and all of the funds went into the pension plan. So it's a win-win situation because we're creating work, but we're also creating income for the pension plan as well, not only by investment income, but the workers there are putting money back into the pension plan as well. We were very fortunate years ago to hire a very, very capable firm, Fengate Real Assets, and I know that Lou Serafini, President CEO, is with us here this morning, and Fengate has done an exceptional job of ensuring that we partner with the right partners in the construction industry, and this is a list, as you can see, of all the investments that we've made in P3s, and that is $7.4 billion that LiUNA has invested in P3s. The next slide is our P3 investments in the power and energy sector, and that's an additional $4.3 billion that we have leveraged in construction. A number of pension plans in Canada are doing a lot of investing in the global P3 space. And in fact, if you look at this slide, some of the very top in the green are all Canadian pension plans that are investing in global infrastructure around the world. So this is why we participate. We have stable and long-term cash flows, attractive risk-adjusted returns, low correlation to equity markets, and strong governmental support. And you can imagine now with the new provincial government in Ontario, and we've had an opportunity to talk to Minister McNaughton and also to Premier Ford, P3s are where the action is. Just want to go very quickly through a few of our investments. You saw that long list, but these are some of the snapshots. This is the Edmonton LRT, $1.2 billion LRT. The next one is the Oakville Traval Hospital. Oakville did not have a hospital. This was built on a greenfield site, $1 billion hospital that LiUNA is a consortium partner in. This is the Waterloo Regional Courthouse, $212 million. $350 million on the Toronto South Detention Center. And then quickly, St. Joseph's in London. This was a $520 million project. This is the Wainwright Mental Health in Pentanguishene, $200 million project. The courthouse here, this is the Elgin County Courthouse, $110 million. Beautiful structure. And of course, we are bidding on a number of LRTs, just like the Edmonton one. The Hamilton is coming up, and there's a whole bunch of them coming up as well. Funding has been a major topic of discussion with the provincial governments, and it's been very controversial in a number of communities, and we're hoping to participate in a number of them as well. Premier Ford has made it very clear that he wants to see more tunneling, more subways, and we're hoping to be bidding on a number of the new lines that come out. And of course, the most recent big P3 were our friends at Aecon and Fluor. Were successful in a $3.8 billion P3 building the Gordie Howe Bridge between Windsor and Detroit. This will be a $4 billion project, and use that multiplier of 6 that Minister McNaughton mentioned. Now we're at $24 billion of economic development as well. And just recently, just yesterday, I found out that Fengate created a consortium with PCL and a few others, Johnson Controls and others as well, and we're successful in winning the LAX in Los Angeles Airport parking garage, which is a $1.2 billion infrastructure project outside of Canada. So, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes my presentation. LiUNA is very pleased to be a significant player in the P3 space. We have some very talented individuals at Fengate and other consultants that work very closely with us to ensure that we get great returns for our pension plan. We're creating great jobs, good paying jobs for the members of LiUNA. We're helping the governments out because they can't afford to use public funds in order to get at the infrastructure deficit that's choking the country. And so win-win situations are very hard and rare to find nowadays, but I think we've succeeded. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. And thanks for agreeing to take a few questions from the audience. Those will come up here in just a moment. But I did want to take an opportunity to say, I think, two things. One, it was wonderful to see the slide that shows you as a member of the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships. What an astute decision that is. Thank you very much for that. But I know it's truly a win-win.
It is.
And I'm also particularly proud of the relationship you have with Fengate and Lou in particular, because as you know, Lou Serafini is on the board of the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships. So thanks for taking the opportunity to recognize him, because he's one fine dude.
Pleasure.
So, questions. Questions are in transit. So I was interested particularly in the comments you were making around the myths with respect to P3s, and particularly the view of some union members out there. I'm interested in maybe a few more of your thoughts around that in terms of, I mean, for us it's a little ironic you made reference to OMERS being an investor in P3s, and of course that's a public sector union, so there is a bit of a difference there in that view. you have any thoughts about how we can actually bring sort of the broader family of unions to your view?
Well, I think what has to happen, it all comes down to education. And I think misconceptions always grow because of misconceptions and the lack of education out there. And in fact, you know, the old saying that a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. And I think that's what's happened here, that folks don't have a very clear picture of what P3s do. And I think targeting the trade union movement and members of that actually contribute into OMERS, into teachers, and into some of the very large pension plans that are, quite frankly, working with P3s would be smart to actually target these groups and educate them. Because right now, that little bit of knowledge they have is wrong and is dangerous because they keep on using the privatization model as, you know, the Darth Vader in the industry, and we're selling off our assets. We're creating P3s in order to take jobs away. Well, in fact, what I just showed you is that it creates jobs. It creates huge amount of man hours in the construction industry. But I only stop there because I represent construction workers. Because, you know, the Oakville hospital that we built created much more than construction jobs. It created nursing jobs, jobs for researchers, doctors, cleaners, etc. And so, you know, this is a great story, not only for us, but it's a story for a whole bunch of other trade unions. Now, when we built that hospital, it wasn't unionized because it's brand new. And as a P3 player, I can't organize for them. And I remember saying this at another P3 conference. I think it's up to them to go in if they want to organize the employees. That has nothing to do with the process of creating a P3.
Mm-hmm. Great answer. And you mentioned Minister McNaughton, who's actually in the room, but so is Minister Steve Crocker, who is the Minister of Transportation and works with for the government of Newfoundland and Labrador.
Oh, wonderful.
And as you may be aware, they've brought a few P3 projects to market recently. And not atypically, they've had a little bit of a response from the public sector unions. So I think the kinds of comments you've made here today will hopefully be very helpful in that.
Yeah, I think that if you have someone like me talking to those groups, that might be helpful because they're getting it from my perspective as opposed from one of our companies or from actually the council as well. So that would be helpful, but this is a process. This isn't going to happen overnight. I mean, it's an educational process.
I appreciate the offer because, as you know, you've been very helpful to us in that way in the past. And I know that as you step off the stage, you're going to go by Minister Crocker, so you never know, something may happen.
Absolutely.
We do have a question here. So do you believe that there is a labor supply risk associated with completing Canada's ambitious infrastructure plan on time?
I believe there's always a risk. You know, clearly with the amount of construction workers that are retiring, yeah, sure, there's always a risk, but we're doing our share of ensuring that younger workers are trained and productive. The problem is that there's a learning curve, and that learning curve takes time. For one of our members who's 60 years old and has 5, 6 different skills, and he retires, you can't expect a young person to step into that role within 6 months or 12 months. It takes time to gain the breadth of 7 different skills. And so, yeah, we're working on it. It's taking time, and we're reaching out to the Indigenous community. We're reaching out to high schools. We're reaching out to immigrants that are coming in. We're reaching out everywhere, and I have to say that we're pretty successful in doing it, mainly because we have a lot of work. And so that does attract young people. When you have a lot of work, it's a little bit easier to say, if you come with us, you're going to make this kind of money. It's helpful, but there's always a risk because we don't know what the future holds, and we've had a challenge bringing young people in. The greatest challenge is the school system, because the school system actually pushes students towards college and university. But our biggest challenge are parents. You know, all the parents feel that all their kids are going to be Nobel Prize winners, and they don't want them to go into construction, and that's problematic. So we have outreach programs as well to get out there. Feel pretty confident that, You know, we represent 10% of the construction industry anyways. I feel pretty confident that those workers can achieve the P3s that are in demand.
That's great. I know time is up. I did, though, just want to make one comment. You made reference to Indigenous communities.
Yes.
I'm really delighted to hear that. And as you know, Indigenous communities across Canada have significant infrastructure deficits that they're trying to address. And we've been working very closely with a number of groups around the country. And we're hoping that more and more projects, particularly in the north, will build into those contractual arrangements provisions to enable the training and development of local communities and obviously Indigenous communities, First Nations communities.
There's no question that, you know, we do these things for altruistic reasons because we want to help these communities raise their standard of living. But there's also a business side to this as well, because a lot of these infrastructure projects are going to go through Indigenous lands. And if you partner with the Indigenous community and ensure that community that they're going to get the lion's share of the work, which we don't mind, we just talked about supply, so why not? I mean, it solves two issues. Then we're again looking at a win-win situation.
Right. Terrific. Thank you very much. And in your name, we've made a donation today to Habitat for Humanity.
Oh, wonderful.
Thank you very much.
That's fantastic. Thank you. It was great.
Thank you so
much.
much.
Well done.